Now that you're done with your display of self-pity, he said sharply, suppose you tell me what you and Hastings did tonight in Lady Trowbridge's garden. Don't use that tone of voice with me, Daphne snapped back, and don't accuse me of indulging in self-pity. For the love of gosh, a man is going to die tomorrow. I am entitled to be a little upset. Colin sat down on a chair opposite her, his face immediately softening into an expression of extreme concern. You'd better tell me everything. Daphne nodded and proceeded to relate the events of the evening. She didn't, however, explain the precise extent of her disgrace. Colin didn't need to know exactly what Anthony had seen. The fact that she'd been caught in a compromising position ought to be enough. She finished with, and now there is going to be a duel and Simon is going to die. You don't know that, Daphne. She shook her head miserably. He won't shoot Anthony. I'd bet my life on it. And Anthony, her voice caught, and she had to swallow before continuing. Anthony is so furious. I don't think he'll elope. What do you want to do? I don't know. I don't even know where the duel is to be held. All I know is that I have to stop it. Colin swore under his breath, then said softly, I don't know if you can, Daphne. I must, she cried out. Colin, I can't sit here and stare at the ceiling while Simon dies. Her voice broke, and she added, I love him. He blanched. Even after he rejected you? She nodded dejectedly. I don't care if that makes me a pathetic imbecile, but I can't help it. I still love him. He needs me. Colin said quietly, if that were true, don't you think he would have agreed to marry you when Anthony demanded it? Daphne shook her head. No, there's something else I don't know about. I can't really explain it, but it was almost as if a part of him wanted to marry me. She could feel herself growing agitated, feel her breath starting to come in jerky gasps, but still she continued. I don't know, Colin, but if you could have seen his face, you'd understand. He was trying to protect me from something, I'm sure of it. I don't know Hastings nearly as well as Anthony, Colin said, or even as well as you, but I've never even heard the barest hint of a whisper about some deep, dark secret. Are you certain? He broke off in the middle of his sentence and let his head fall into his hands for a moment before looking back up. When he spoke again, his voice was achingly gentle. Are you certain you might not be imagining his feelings for you? Daphne took no offense. She knew her story sounded a fantasy, but she knew in her heart that she was right. I don't want him to die, she said in a low voice. In the end, that's all that's important. Colin nodded, but then asked one last question. You don't want him to die, or you don't want him to die on your account? Daphne stood on shaky feet. I think you'd better leave, she said, using every last bit of her energy to keep her voice steady. I can't believe you just asked me that. But Colin didn't leave. He just reached over and squeezed his sister's hand. I'll help you, Daph. You know I'd do anything for you. And Daphne just fell into his arms and let out all the tears she'd been keeping so valiantly inside. 30 minutes later, her eyes were dried and her mind was clear. She'd needed to cry, she realized that. There'd been too much trapped inside her, too much feeling, too much confusion, hurt, and anger. She'd had to let it out. But now there was no more time for emotion. She needed to keep a cool head and remain focused on her goal. Colin had gone off to question Anthony and Benedict, whom he'd said were talking in low and intense voices in Anthony's study. He'd agreed with her that Anthony had most probably asked Benedict to act as his second. It was Colin's job to get them to tell him where the duel was to take place. Daphne had no doubt that Colin would succeed. He'd always been able to get anybody to tell him anything. Daphne had dressed in her oldest, most comfortable riding habits. She had no idea how the morning would play out, but the last thing she wanted was to be tripping over lace and petticoats. A swift knock on her door brought her to attention, and before she could even reach for the knob, Colin entered the room. He too had changed out of his evening clothes. "Did you find out everything?" Daphne asked urgently. His nod was sharp and brief. "We don't have much time to lose. I assume you want to try to get there before anyone else arrives." "If Simon gets there before Anthony, maybe I can convince him to marry me before anyone even pulls a gun." Colin let out a tense breath. "Daph," he began, "have you considered the possibility that you might not succeed?" She swallowed, her throat feeling like it had a cannonball launched in it. "I'm trying not to think about that. But—" Daphne cut him off. "If I think about it," she replied in a strange voice, "I might lose my focus. I might lose my nerve. And I can't do that. For Simon's sake, I can't do that." "I hope he knows. I hope he knows what he has in you," Colin said quietly, "because if he doesn't, I may have to shoot him myself." Daphne just said, "We'd better go." Colin nodded and they were off. Simon guided his horse along Broad Walk, making his way to the farthest, most remote corner in the new Regent's Park. Anthony had suggested, and he had agreed, that they carry out their business far from Mayfair. It was dawn, of course, and no one was likely to be out, but there was no reason to be flaunting a duel in Hyde Park. Not that Simon much cared that dueling was illegal. After all, he wouldn't be around to suffer the legal consequences. It was, however, a damned distasteful way to die, but Simon didn't see any alternatives. He had disgraced a gently bred lady whom he could not marry, and now he must suffer the consequences. It was nothing Simon had not known before he'd kissed her. As he made his way to the designated field, he saw that Anthony and Benedict had already dismounted and were waiting for him. Their chestnut hair ruffled in the breeze, and their faces looked grim, almost as grim as Simon's heart. He brought his horse to a halt a few yards away from the Bridgerton brothers, and dismounted. "Where's your second?" Benedict called out. "Didn't bother with it," Simon replied. "But you have to have a second. A duel isn't a duel without one." Simon just shrugged. There didn't seem a point. "You brought the guns, I trust you?" Anthony walked toward him. "I don't want to do this," he said. "You don't have a choice." "But you do," Anthony said urgently. "You could marry her. Maybe you don't love her, but I know you like her well enough. Why won't you marry her?" Simon thought about telling them everything, all the reasons he'd sworn never to take a wife, and perpetuate his line. But they wouldn't understand. Not the Bridgertons, who only knew that family was good and kind and true. They didn't know anything about cruel words and shattered dreams. They didn't know the impossible feeling of rejection. Simon then thought about saying something cruel, something that would make Anthony and Benedict despise him, and get this mockery of a duel over with more quickly. But that would require him to malign Daphne, and he just couldn't do that. And so, in the end, all he did was look up into the face of Anthony Bridgerton, the man who had been his friend since his earliest days at Eton, and said, "Just to know it isn't Daphne. Your sister is the finest woman I've ever had the pleasure and the privilege to know." And then, with a nod to both Anthony and Benedict, he picked up one of his two pistols in the case Benedict had laid on the ground, and began his long walk to the north side of the field. "Wait!" Simon gasped and whirled around. Dear gosh, it was Daphne. She was bent low over her mare, in full gallop as she raced across the field, and for one stunned moment Simon forgot to be absolutely furious with her for intervening with the duel, and instead just marveled at how utterly magnificent she looked in the saddle. By the time she yanked on the reins and brought the horse to a halt right in front of him, however, his rage was back in full force. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "Saving your miserable life?" Her eyes flashed fire at him, and he realized he'd never seen her so angry, almost as angry as he was. "Daphne, you little idiot, do you realize how dangerous this little stunt was?" Without realizing what he was doing, his hands wrapped around her shoulders and started to shake. "One of us could have shot you." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You hadn't even reached your end of the field." She had a point, but he was far too furious to acknowledge it. "And riding here in the dead of night by yourself?" he yelled. "You should know better." "I do know better," she shot back. "Colin escorted me." "Colin?" Simon's head whipped back and forth as he looked for the youngest of the older brothers. "I am going to kill him." "Would that be before or after Anthony shoots you through the heart?" "Oh, definitely before," Simon growled. "Where is he? Bridgerton!" he bellowed. Three chestnut heads swiveled in his direction. Simon stomped across the grass, murder in his eyes. "I meant the idiot Bridgerton." "That, I believe," Anthony said mildly, tilting his chin toward Colin, "would refer to you." Colin turned a deadly stare in his direction. "And I was supposed to let her stay at home and cry her eyes out?" "Yes!" This came from three different sources. "Simon!" Daphne yelled, tripping across the grass after him. "Get back here!" Simon turned to Benedict. "Get her out of here!" Benedict looked undecided. "Do it!" Anthony ordered. Benedict held still, his eyes darting back and forth between his brothers, his sister, and the man who'd shamed her. "For the love of Christ!" Anthony swore. "She deserves to have her say," Benedict said, and crossed his arms. "What the hell is wrong with you two?" Anthony roared, glaring at his two younger brothers. "Simon," Daphne said, gasping for breath after her race across the field, "you must listen to me." Simon tried to ignore her tugs on his sleeve. "Daphne, leave it. There's nothing you can do." Daphne looked pleadingly at her brothers. Colin and Benedict were obviously sympathetic, but there was little they could do to help her. Anthony still looked like an angry god. Finally, she did the only thing she could think of to delay the duel. She punched Simon in his good eye. Simon howled in pain as he staggered back. "What the hell was that for?" "Fall down, you idiot," she hissed. If he was if he was prostrate on the ground, Anthony couldn't very well shoot him. I am certainly not going to fall down. He clutched his eye as he muttered, Good gosh! Being felled by a woman, intolerable. Men, Daphne grunted. Idiots, all. She turned to her brothers, who were staring at her with identical expressions of open-mouthed shock. What are you looking at? She snapped. Colin started to clap. Anthony smacked him in the shoulder. Might I have one single, tiny, ever so brief moment with His Grace? She asked. Half the words were hisses. Colin and Benedict nodded and walked away. Anthony didn't move. Daphne glared at him. I'll hit you too. And she might have done it too, except that Benedict returned and nearly yanked Anthony's arm out of the socket as he pulled him away. She stared at Simon, who was pressing his fingers against his eyebrow, as if that might lessen the pain in his eye. I can't believe you punched me, he said. She glanced back at her brothers to make sure they'd moved out of earshot. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I don't know what you hoped to accomplish here, he said. I should think that would be abundantly obvious. He sighed, and in that moment he looked weary and sad and infinitely old. I've already told you I cannot marry you. You have to. Her words emerged with such urgency and force that he looked up, his eyes on sharp alert. What do you mean? He asked, his voice a study in control. I mean that we were seen. By whom? Macclesfield. Simon relaxed visibly. He won't talk. But there were others. Daphne bit her lip. It wasn't necessarily a lie. There might have been others. In fact, there probably were others. Whom? I don't know, she admitted, but I've heard rumors and rumblings. By tomorrow it will be all over London. Simon swore so viciously that Daphne actually took a step back. If you don't marry me, she said in a low voice, I will be ruined. That's not true, but his voice lacked conviction. It is true, and you know it. She forced her eyes to meet his. Her entire future and his life was riding on this moment. She couldn't afford to falter. No one will have me. I shall be packed away to some God-forsaken corner of the country. You know your mother would never send you away. But I will never marry. You know that. She took a step forward, forcing him to acknowledge her nearness. I will be forever branded as used goods. I'll never have a husband, never bear children. Stop! Simon fairly yelled. For the love of gosh, just stop! Anthony, Benedict, and Colin all started at his shout, but Daphne's frantic shake of her head kept them in their places. Why can't you marry me? She asked in a low voice. I know you care for me. What is it? Simon wrapped his hand across his face, his thumb and forefinger pressing mercilessly into his temples. Christ, he had a headache. And Daphne, dear gosh, she kept moving closer. She reached out and touched his shoulder, then his cheek. He wasn't strong enough, dear gosh. He wasn't going to be strong enough. Simon, she pleaded, save me. And he was lost. A duel, a duel, a duel. Is there anything more exciting, more romantic, or more utterly moronic? It has reached this author's ears that a duel took place earlier this week in Regent's Park. Because dueling is illegal, This author shall not reveal the names of the perpetrators, but let it be known that this author frowns heavily upon such violence. Of course, as this issue goes to press, it appears that the two dueling idiots, I am loath to call them gentlemen, that would imply a certain degree of intelligence, a quality which, if they ever possessed it, clearly eluded them that morning, are both unharmed. One wonders if perhaps an angel of sensibility and rationality smiled down upon them that fateful morn. If so, it is the belief of this author that this angel ought to shed her influence on a great many more men of the tongue. Such an action could only make for a more peaceful and amiable environment, leading to a vast improvement of our world. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, May 19th, 1813. Simon raised ravished eyes to meet hers. "I'll marry you," he said in a low voice, "but you need to know—" His sentence was rendered incomplete by her exultant shout and fierce hug. "Oh, Simon, you won't be sorry," she said, her words coming out in a relieved rush. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears, but they glowed with joy. "I'll make you happy, I promise you. I'll make you so happy. You won't regret this." "Stop!" Simon ground out, pushing her away. Her unfeigned joy was too much to bear. "You have to listen to me." She stilled, and her face grew apprehensive. "You listen to what I have to say," he said in a harsh voice, "and then decide if you want to marry me." Her bottom lip caught between her teeth, and she gave the barest of nods. Simon took in a shaky breath. How to tell her? What to tell her? He couldn't tell her the truth, not all of it at least, but she had to understand. If she married him, she'd be giving up more than she'd ever dreamed. He had to give her the opportunity to refuse him. She deserved that much. Simon swallowed, guilt sliding uncomfortably down his throat. She deserved much more than that, but that was all he could give her. "Daphne," he said, her name as always soothing his frizzled mouth. "If you marry me—" She stepped toward him and reached out her hand, only to pull it back at his burning glare of caution. "What is it?" she whispered. Surely nothing could be so awful that— "I can't have children." There, he'd done it, and it was almost the truth. Daphne's lips parted, but other than that, there was no indication that she'd even heard him. He knew his words would be brutal, but he saw no other way to force her understanding. "If you marry me, you'll never have children. You will never hold a baby in your arms and know it is yours, that you created it in love. You will never—" "How do you know?" she interrupted, her voice flat and unnaturally loud. "I just do. But—" "I cannot have children," he repeated cruelly. "You need to understand that." "I see." Her mouth was quivering slightly, as if she wasn't quite sure if she had anything to say, and her eyelids seemed to be blinking a bit more than normal. Simon searched her face, but he couldn't read her emotions the way he usually could. Normally her expressions were so open, her eyes startlingly honest. It was as if he could see to her very soul and back. But right now she looked shuttered and frozen. She was upset, that much was clear, but he had no idea what she was going to say, no idea how she would react. And Simon had the strangest feeling that Daphne didn't know either. He became aware of a presence to his right, and he turned to see Anthony, his face torn between anger and concern. Is there a problem? Anthony asked softly, his eyes straying to his sister's tortured face. Before Simon could reply, Daphne said, "No." All eyes turned to her. "There will be no duel," she said. "His Grace and I will be getting married." "I see." Anthony looked up. Anthony looked as if he wanted to react with considerably more relief, but his sister's solemn face forced a strange quietude on the scene. "I'll tell the others," he said, and walked off. Simon felt a rush of something utterly foreign, fill his lungs. It was air, he realized, dumbly. He'd been holding his breath. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. And something else filled him as well. Something hot and terrible. Something triumphant and wonderful. It was emotion, pure and undiluted. A bizarre mix of relief and joy and desire and dread. And Simon, who'd spent most of his life avoiding such messy feelings, had no idea what to do about it. His eyes found Daphne's. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice whisper soft. She nodded, her face strangely devoid of emotion. "You're worth it." Then she walked slowly back to her horse. And Simon was left wondering if he had just been snatched up into heaven, or perhaps led to the darkest corner of hell. Well, Daphne spent the rest of the day surrounded by her family. Everyone was, of course, thrilled by the news of her engagement. Everyone, that was, except her older brothers, who, while happy for her, were somewhat subdued. Daphne didn't blame them. She felt rather subdued herself. The events of the day had left them all exhausted. It was decided that the wedding must take place with all possible haste. Violet had been informed that Daphne might have been seen kissing Simon in Lady Trowbridge's garden, and that was enough for her to immediately send a request to the Archbishop for a special license. Violet had then immersed herself in a whirlwind of party details. Just because the wedding was to be small, she'd announced, it didn't have to be shabby. Eloise, Francesca, and Hyacinth, all vastly excited at the prospect of dressing up as bridesmaids, kept up a steady stream of questions. How had Simon proposed? Did he get down on one knee? What color would Daphne wear, and when would he give her a ring? Daphne did her best to answer their questions, but she could barely concentrate on her sisters, and by the time afternoon slipped into the eve, she was reduced to monosyllables. Finally, after Hyacinth asked her what color roses she wanted for her bouquet, and Daphne answered 3, her sisters gave up talking to her and left her alone. The enormity of her actions had left Daphne nearly speechless. She had saved a man's life. She had secured a promise of marriage from the man she adored. And she had committed herself to a life without children, all in one day. She laughed, somewhat desperately. It made one wonder what she could do tomorrow as an encore. She wished she knew what had gone through her head in those last moments before she'd turned to Anthony and said, "There will be no duel." But in all truth, she wasn't sure it was anything she could possibly remember. Whatever had been racing through her mind, it hadn't been made up of words or sentences or conscious thought. It had been as if she was enveloped by color, reds and yellows, and a swirling mishmash of orange where they met. Pure feeling and instinct. That's all there had been. No reason, no logic, nothing even remotely rational or sane. And somehow, as all of that churned violently within her, she'd known what she had to do. She might be able to live without the children she hadn't yet born, but she couldn't live without Simon. The children were amorphous, unknown beings she couldn't picture or touch. But Simon was real and he was here. She knew how it felt to touch his cheek, to laugh in his presence. She knew the sweet taste of his kiss and the very quirk of his smile, and she loved him. And although she barely dared think it, maybe he was wrong. Maybe he could have children. Maybe he'd been misled by an incompetent surgeon. Or maybe God was just waiting for the right time to bestow a miracle. She'd been unlikely to mother a brood the size of the Bridgertons. But if she could have even one child, she knew she'd feel complete. She wouldn't mention these thoughts to Simon, though. If the thought she was holding out even the tiniest hope for a child, he wouldn't marry her. She was sure of it. He'd gone to such lengths to be brutally honest. He wouldn't allow her to make a decision if he didn't think she had the facts absolutely straight. Daphne? Daphne, who had been sitting listlessly on the sofa in the Bridgertons' drawing room, looked up to see her mother gazing at her with an expression of deep concern. "Are you all right?" Violet asked. Daphne forced a weary smile. "I'm just tired," she replied, and she was. It hadn't even occurred to her until that very moment that she hadn't slept in over 36 hours. Violet sat beside her. "I thought you'd be more excited. I know how much you love Simon." Daphne turned surprised eyes to her mother's face. "It's not hard to see," Violet said gently. She patted her on the hand. "He's a good man. You've chosen well." Daphne felt a wobbly smile coming on. She had chosen well, and she would make the best of her marriage. If they weren't blessed with children, well, she reasoned, she might have turned out to be barren anyway. She knew of several couples who had never had children, and she doubted any of them had known of their deficiencies prior to their marriage vows. And with 7 brothers and sisters, she was sure to have plenty of nieces and nephews to hug and spoil. Better to live with the man she loved than to have children with one she didn't. "Why don't you take a nap?" Violet suggested. "You look terribly tired. I hate seeing such dark smudges below your eyes." Daphne nodded and stumbled to her feet. Her mother knew best. Sleep was what she needed. "I'm sure I'll feel much better in an hour or so," she said, a wide yawn escaping her mouth. Violet stood and offered her daughter her arm. "I don't think you're going to be able to make it up the stairs on your own," she said, smiling as she led Daphne out of the room and up the stairs. and I sincerely doubt we'll see you in an hour or two. I shall give everyone explicit instructions that you are not to be disturbed until morning. Daphne nodded sheepishly. Daphne nodded sleepily. That's good, she mumbled, stumbling into her room. Morning's good. Violet steered Daphne to the bed and helped her into it. The shoes she pulled off, but that was all. You might as well sleep in your clothes, she said softly, then bent to kiss her daughter on the forehead. I can't imagine I'll be able to move you enough to get you out of them. Daphne's only reply was a snore. Simon, too, was exhausted. It wasn't every day that a man resigned himself to death, and then to be saved by and betrothed to the woman who had occupied his every dreams for near or the past 2 weeks. If he weren't sporting 2 black eyes and a sizable bruise on his chin, he'd have thought he'd dreamed the whole thing. Did Daphne realize what she'd done? What she was denying herself? She was a level-headed girl, not given to foolish dreams and flights of fancy. He didn't think she would have agreed to marry him without sorting through all the consequences. But then again, she'd reached her decision in under a minute. How could she have thought everything through in under a minute? Unless she fancied herself in love with him, would she give up her dream of a family because she loved him? But whatever her motives, the simple truth was that come this Saturday, Lady Bridgerton had already sent him a note informing him that the engagement would not be an extended one. He would be bound to Daphne for life, and she to him. There was no stopping it now, he realized. Daphne would never back out of the marriage at this point, and neither would he. And to his utter surprise, this almost fatalistic certainty felt good. Daphne would be his. She knew of his shortcomings. She knew what he could not give her, and she had still chosen him. It warmed his heart more than he would ever have thought possible. Your Grace? Simon looked up from his slouchy position in his study's leather chair. Not that he needed to. The low, even voice was obviously that of his butler. Yes, Jeffries? Lord Bridgerton is here to see you. Shall I inform him that you are not at home? Simon pulled himself to his feet. Damn. But he was tired. He won't believe you. Geoffrey nodded. Very well, sir. He took 3 steps, then turned around. Are you certain you wish to receive a guest? You do seem to be a trifle indisposed. Simon let out a single humorless chuckle. If you are referring to my eyes, Lord Bridgerton would be the one responsible for the larger of the 2 bruises. Jeffries blinked like an owl. The larger, Your Grace? Simon managed a half smile. It wasn't easy. His entire face hurt. I realize it's difficult to discern, but my right eye is actually a touch worse off than the left. Jeffries swayed closer, clearly intrigued. Trust me. The butler straightened. Of course. Shall I show Lord Bridgerton to the drawing room? No. Bring him here. At Geoffrey's nervous swallow, Simon added, and you needn't worry for my safety. Lord Bridgerton isn't likely to add to my injuries at this juncture. Not, he added in a mutter, that he'd find it easy to find a spot he hasn't already injured. Geoffrey's eyes widened, and he scurried out of the room. A moment later, Anthony Bridgerton strode in. He took one look at Simon and said, "You look like hell." Simon stood and raised a brow, not an easy feat in his current condition. "This surprises you?" Anthony laughed. The sound was a little mirthless, a little hollow, but Simon heard a shadow of his old friend, a shadow of their old friendship. He was surprised by how grateful he was for that. Anthony motioned to Simon's eyes. "Which one is mine?" "The right," Simon replied, gingerly touching his abused skin. "Daphne packs quite a punch for a girl, but she lacks your size and strength." "Still," Anthony said, leaning forward to inspect his sister's handiwork, "she did quite a nice job." "You should be proud of her," Simon grunted. "Hurts like the devil." "Good." And then they were silent, with so much to say and no idea how to say it. "I never wanted it to be like this," Anthony finally said. "Nor I." Anthony leaned against the edge of Simon's desk, but he shifted uncomfortably, looking oddly ill, at ease in his own body. "It wasn't easy for me to let you court her. You knew it wasn't real. You made it real last night." What was he to say? That Daphne had been the seducer, not he? That she'd been the one to lead him off the terrace and dance into the darkness of the night? None of that mattered. He was far more experienced than Daphne. He should have been able to stop. He said nothing. "I hope we may put this behind us," Anthony said. "I'm certain that would be Daphne's fondest wish." Anthony's eyes narrowed. "And is it now your aim in life to grant her fondest wishes?" All but one, Simon thought. All but the one that really matters. "You know that I will do everything in my capabilities to keep her happy," he said quietly. Anthony nodded. "If you hurt her—" "I will never hurt her," Simon vowed, his eyes blazing. Anthony regarded him with a long and even stare. "I was prepared to kill you for dishonoring her. If you damage her soul, I guarantee you will never find peace as long as you live. Which," he added, his eyes turning slightly harder, "would not be long." "Just long enough to put me in excruciating pain?" Simon asked mildly. "Exactly." Simon nodded. Even though Anthony was threatening torture and death, Simon could not help but respect him for it. Devotion to one's sister was an honorable thing. Simon wondered if Anthony perhaps saw something in him that no one else did. They had known each other for over half of their lives. Did Anthony somehow see the darkest corners of his soul? The anguish and fury he tried so hard to keep hidden? And if so, was that why he worried for his sister's happiness? "I give you my word," Simon said. "I will do everything in my power to keep Daphne safe and content." Anthony nodded curtly. "See that you do." He pushed himself away from the desk and walked to the door. "Or you'll be seeing me." He left. Simon groaned and sank back into the leather chair. When had his life grown so damned complicated? When had friends become enemies and flirtations grown to lust? And what the hell was he going to do with Daphne? He didn't want to hurt her, couldn't bear to hurt her, actually, and yet he was doomed to do so simply by marrying her. He burned for her, ached for the day when he could lay her down and cover her body with his, slowly entering her until she moaned his name. He shuddered. Such thoughts could not possibly be advantageous to his health. Your Grace? Jeffries again. Simon was too tired to look up, so he just made an acknowledging motion with his hand. Perhaps you would like to retire for the evening, Your Grace. Simon managed to look at the clock, but that was only because he didn't have to move his head to do it. It was barely 7 in the evening, hardly his usual bedtime. It's early yet, he mumbled. Still, the butler said pointedly, perhaps you'd like to retire. Simon closed his eyes. Jeffries had a point. Maybe what he needed was a long engagement with his feather mattress and fine linen sheets. He could escape to his bedroom, where he might manage to avoid seeing a Bridgerton for an entire night. Hell, the way he felt, he might hole up there for days. It's marriage for the Duke of Hastings and Miss Bridgerton. This author must take this opportunity to remind you, dear reader, that the forthcoming nuptials were predicted in this very column. It has not escaped the note of this author that when this newspaper reports a new attachment between an eligible gentleman and an unmarried lady, the odds in the betting books at gentlemen's clubs change within hours and always in favor of marriage. Although this author is not allowed in whites, she has reason to believe that the official odds concerning the marriage of the Duke and Miss Bridgerton were 2-1, or Lady Whistledown Society Papers, May 21st, 1813. The rest of the week flew by in a rush. Daphne didn't see Simon for several days. She might have thought he'd left town, except that Anthony told her he'd been over to Hastings' house to settle the details of the marriage contract. Much to Anthony's surprise, Simon had refused to accept even a penny as dowry. Finally, the two men had decided that Anthony would put the money his father had put aside for Daphne's marriage in a separate estate with himself as the trustee. It would be hers to spend or save as she liked. You can pass it along to your children, Anthony suggested. Daphne only smiled. It was either that or cry. A few days after that, Simon called upon Bridgerton House in the afternoon. It was 2 days before the wedding. Daphne waited in the drawing room after Humboldt announced his arrival. She sat primly on the edge of the Damascus sofa, her back straight and her hands clasped together in her lap. She was ashore, the very model of genteel English womanhood. She felt a bundle of nerves. Correction, she thought, as her stomach turned itself inside out, a bundle of nerves with frayed edges. She looked down at her hands and realized that her fingernails were leaving red, crescent-shaped indentations on her palms. Second correction, a bundle of nerves with frayed edges with an arrow stuck through them, maybe a flaming arrow at that. The urge to laugh was almost as overwhelming as it was inappropriate. She had never felt nervous at seeing Simon before. In fact, That had been possibly the most remarkable aspect of their relationship, even when she caught him gazing at her with smoldering heat, and she was sure that her eyes reflected the same need. She had felt utterly comfortable with him. Yes, her stomach flipped and her skin tingled, but those were symptoms of desire, not of unease. First and foremost, Simon had been her friend, and Daphne knew that the easy, happy feeling she'd experienced whenever he was near was not something to be taken for granted. She was confident that they would find their way back to that sense of comfort and companionship, but after the scene in Regent's Park, she very much feared that this would occur later rather than sooner. Good day, Daphne. Simon appeared in the doorway, filling it with his marvelous appearance. Well, perhaps his presence wasn't quite as marvelous as usual. His eyes still sported matching purple bruises, and the one on his chin was starting to turn an impressive shade of green. Still, it was better than a bullet in the heart. Simon, Daphne replied, how nice to see you. What brings you to Bridgerton House? He gave her a surprised look. Aren't we betrothed? She blushed. Yes, of course. It was my impression that men were supposed to visit their betrothed. He sat down across from her. Didn't Lady Whistledown say something to that effect? I don't think so, Daphne murmured. But I am certain my mother must have done. They both smiled, and for a moment Daphne thought that all would be well again. But as soon as the smiles faded, an uncomfortable silence fell across the room. Are your eyes feeling any better? She finally asked. They don't look quite as swollen. Do you think? Simon turned so that he was facing a large gilt mirror. I rather think the bruises have turned a spectacular shade of blue. Purple. He leaned forward, not that brought him appreciably closer to the mirror. Purple, then, but I suppose it might be a debatable fact. Do they hurt? He smiled humorlessly. Only when someone pokes at them. I shall refrain from doing so then, she murmured, her lips quirking in a telltale twitch. It shall be difficult, of course, but I shall persevere. Yes, he said, with a perfectly deadpan expression. I've often been told I make women want to poke me in the eye. Daphne's smile was one of relief. Surely if they could joke about such things, everything would go back to the way it was. Simon cleared his throat. I did have a specific reason for coming to see you. Daphne gazed at him expectantly, waiting for him to continue. He held out a jeweler's box. This is for you. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for the small, velvet-covered box. Are you certain? She asked. I believe betrothal rings are considered quite de rigueur, he said quietly. Oh, how stupid of me. I didn't realize that it was a betrothal ring. What did you think it was? I wasn't thinking, she admitted, sheepishly. He'd never given her a gift before. She'd been so taken aback by the gesture she'd completely forgotten that he owed her a betrothal ring. Owed. She didn't like that word, didn't like that she'd even thought it, but she was fairly certain that that was what Simon must have been thinking when he'd picked out the ring. This depressed her. Daphne forced a smile. Is this a family heirloom? No, he said, with enough vehemence to make her blink. Oh. Yet another awkward silence. He coughed and then said, I thought you might like something of your own. All of the Hastings jewelry was chosen for someone else. This I chose for you. Daphne thought it's a wonder she didn't melt on the spot. That's so sweet, she said, just barely managing to stifle a sentimental sniffle. Simon squirmed in his seat, which didn't surprise her. Men did so hate to be called sweet. Aren't you going to open it? He grunted. Oh, yes, of course. Daphne shook her head slightly as she snapped back to attention. How silly of me. Her eyes had glazed over slightly as she stared at the jeweler's box. Blinking a few times to clear her vision, she carefully released the box's clasp and opened it, and couldn't possibly say anything besides, "Oh my goodness," and even that came out with more breath than voice. Nestled in the box was a stunning band of white gold, adorned with a large marquise, cut emerald, flanked on either side by a single perfect diamond. It was the most beautiful piece of jewelry Daphne had ever seen, brilliant but elegant, obviously precious but not overly showy. It's beautiful, she whispered. I love it. Are you certain? Simon removed his gloves, then leaned forward and took the ring out of the box. Because it is your ring, you shall be the one to wear it, and it should reflect your tastes, not mine. Daphne's voice shook slightly as she said, Clearly, our tastes coincide. Simon breathed a small sigh of relief and picked up her hand. He hadn't realized how much it meant to him that she liked the ring until that very moment. He hated that he felt so nervous around her when they'd been such easy friends for the past few weeks. He hated that there were silences in their own conversations, when before she'd been the only person with whom he never felt the need to pause and take stock of his words. Not that he was having any trouble speaking now. It was just that he didn't seem to know what to say. May I put it on? He asked softly. She nodded and started to remove her glove. But Simon stilled her fingers with his own, then took over the task. He gave the tip of each finger a tug, then slowly slid the glove from her hand. The motion was unabashedly erotic, clearly an abbreviated version of what he wanted to do, remove every stitch from her body. Daphne gasped as the edge of the glove trailed past the tips of her fingers. The sound of her breath rushing across her lips made him want her all the more. With tremulous hands, he slid the ring on her finger, easing it over her knuckle until it rested in place. It fits perfectly, she said, moving her hands this way and that so that she could see how it reflected the light. Simon, however, didn't let go of her hand. As she moved, her skin slid along his, creating a warmth that was oddly soothing. Then he lifted her hand to his mouth and dropped a gentle kiss on her knuckles. I'm glad, he murmured. It suits you.